My name is Russell Whitaker. I am 47 years old, and I manage a self-storage facility on the outskirts of Amarillo, Texas. I have been in that position for over a decade. The job is steady and predictable. Most of my day is paperwork, maintenance checks, and occasional customer questions. By December, activity usually slows down. People focus on the holidays, not storage units. The facility sits just off Interstate 40, surrounded by flat land and dry winter wind. We have a keypad gate at the entrance, security cameras covering each aisle, and a small office near the front fence. Everything runs on a digital log system that records gate access by code. 3 years ago, during the week before Christmas, I noticed something unusual while reviewing the nightly access reports. A unit registered entry at 2:18 a.m. The renter attached to that code had passed away 2 months earlier. His name was Leonard Pike. He had rented a climate-controlled unit for almost 9 years. Quiet man, always paid on time, rarely spoke beyond basic greetings. After he passed in October, his daughter contacted me. She said she lived in Oklahoma and would come by after the holidays to clear his belongings. Until then, the unit remained locked under his existing code. When I saw the 2:18 a.m. entry under Leonard's code, I assumed it was a software glitch. Our system occasionally froze during cold snaps. That week, nighttime temperatures had dropped into the 20s. I checked the camera footage for that timestamp. The gate slid open slowly. No vehicle entered. The driveway between the fence lines remained empty. No headlights. No pedestrian walking through. After about 30 seconds, the gate closed again. I replayed the footage twice. The system clearly recorded his personal code being entered. The screen inside the office even displayed the last 4 digits of the code as valid, but there was no one visible. The following night, it happened again at almost the exact same time, 2:19 a.m. The gate opened. No one entered. The gate closed. I began to pay closer attention. On the third night, I decided to stay late in the office and watch the live camera feed instead of reviewing it in the morning. Around 2:17 a.m., I heard the faint mechanical hum of the gate motors starting up. The exterior security lights switched on automatically. I stepped outside the office and stood near the entrance, keeping myself in view of the cameras. The gate opened fully. Cold air moved to the fence opening, but nothing else did. No engine noise. No footsteps on gravel. The road outside was empty. Then I heard a metallic sound from deeper inside the facility. It was faint, but clear enough to recognize. The rolling sound of a storage unit door being lifted. Leonard's unit was in the third interior row, halfway down. I knew that location by memory. I hesitated for a moment, considering whether to call the police immediately, but I didn't see any signs of forced entry, and curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and walked down the main aisle. The rows were quiet. The wind made a low humming noise along the metal walls. As I turned the corner into Leonard's row, I saw his unit door raise about 2 feet from the ground. I was certain it had been fully locked when I closed the office earlier that evening. I conduct nightly visual checks before leaving the lot. I approached slowly. The padlock was hanging open on the latch, but not broken. It looked as if someone had unlocked it normally. I crouched and shined my flashlight inside. The unit contained neatly stacked cardboard boxes, a wooden rocking chair wrapped in plastic, and several plastic bins labeled with masking tape. Near the back wall, there was a small artificial Christmas tree, about 3 feet tall. I had noticed it during routine inspections in past years. Leonard used to mention that he kept sentimental items in there. The tree lights were on. They blinked softly in alternating white patterns. The glow reflected off the metal interior walls. There were no visible extension cords plugged into any outlet. In fact, the climate-controlled units in that section did not have interior power outlets available to renters. Lighting came from overhead hallway fixtures only. I stepped fully inside, half expecting someone to be standing behind the stacked boxes. The air felt colder than usual. Not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. I heard nothing besides a faint click of the blinking bulbs. After a few seconds, I backed out and lowered the door completely. I secured the padlock. My hands felt steady. I was not panicked, just unsettled. When I returned to the office, I checked the interior camera feed that covered Leonard's aisle. At 2:22 a.m., the footage showed the door rising slowly from the inside. There was no visible person beneath it. The door simply lifted. I paused the footage and replayed it several times. There were no shadows indicating movement, no shift in air that would suggest someone pulling from outside, just the door lifting. I called the Amarillo Police Department and explained the situation as a possible trespassing issue. 2 officers arrived within 15 minutes. We walked together back to the unit. The door was closed again. The padlock was secured. When we opened it, the Christmas tree lights were off. The officers searched the facility thoroughly. They checked the fence for damage and reviewed camera footage from earlier hours. They found no evidence of forced entry or unauthorized presence. One officer suggested the possibility of a copy code. Another suggested system malfunction. Neither explanation accounted for the physical movement of the door visible on camera. The next morning, I contacted Leonard's daughter to inform her of the incident. She sounded tired but not surprised. She told me her father had a habit of decorating that storage unit every December. He would set up that small tree and sit inside with the lights on, sometimes for hours. She said he told her it was the quietest place he knew. I asked her whether there was any battery pack connected to the tree. She said no. It was an older plug-in model that required a wall outlet. Over the next few nights, the gate continued to open at approximately 2:18 a.m. No vehicle entered. The logs consistently recorded Leonard's code. I reset the entire keypad system and changed all master settings. The activity stopped immediately afterward. In early January, Leonard's daughter arrived to clear the unit. I helped her carry boxes to her rental truck. When she unplugged the Christmas tree from a small extension cord coil behind it, we both paused. There were no outlets in that unit. The extension cord was not connected to anything. The metal prongs on the tree's plug were slightly bent outward, as though they had been recently pulled from a tight socket. Neither of us commented on it directly. We continued loading the truck in silence. Once the unit was emptied, I replaced the lock and permanently deleted Leonard's access code from the system. Since then, I have not experienced another unexplained gate entry. The keypad functions normally. The cameras show only what should be there. Every December, though, I find myself checking the nightly logs more carefully. Around 2:17 a.m., I often wake up without setting an alarm. I lie there for a moment, listening to the quiet of my house. I no longer stay late at the facility during the holidays. I lock the office at closing time and let the automated system handle the night. I do not claim that anything impossible occurred. Equipment fails, software glitches. People sometimes misunderstand what they see on camera. I have considered all those possibilities carefully. What I cannot fully account for is the combination of details. A deceased renter's code repeatedly activating, a gate opening to no visible presence, a storage door lifting from inside, and a small Christmas tree glowing in a unit with no power source. There was no threat, no damage, nothing stolen, just activity where there should have been none. It lasted for exactly 1 week before Christmas. Then it stopped. My name is Gregory Shaw. I am 55 years old, and I worked winter road maintenance for the state of Colorado for almost 20 years. This happened in the winter of 2018, when I was assigned to a remote mountain route outside Leadville. It was a long 2-lane stretch of Highway 91 that ran between heavy pine forest and open snowfields. In the winter months, traffic was light, especially after midnight. My shift started at 10:30 p.m. and ended around 6:30 in the morning. Most nights were predictable. I would drive slowly, lower the blade, clear the buildup, spread salt where needed, and repeat the same pattern until sunrise. About 12 miles north of town, there was an old property set back from the highway. It used to be a mining supply house decades ago, but by the time I started running that route, it had been abandoned for years. The building was 2 stories, faded red paint almost gone, windows either boarded or broken. Snow usually drifted across the long dirt driveway, completely covering it by mid-December. No one lived there. At least, no one was supposed to. In early January, after a steady week of snowfall, I noticed something different. As I approached the property around 1:15 a.m., I saw a faint yellow light glowing from inside the first floor window. It wasn't bright, just enough to be noticeable through the falling snow. I slowed down slightly, assuming maybe the property had been sold. That happens from time to time in mountain towns. People buy old buildings with plans to renovate. The next night, the light was still there. Same window, same soft glow. The driveway, which had been completely buried before, now had a narrow cleared path cutting through the snow. It wasn't plowed with equipment. It looked shoveled, uneven, and about 3 feet wide. There were no visible tire tracks leading to the highway, which I found strange. If someone had moved in, they would need a vehicle, but the snow between the road and the start of the cleared path was untouched. Over the next week, I passed that property every night. The light remained on constantly. I never saw it turn off, even during the early morning hours when the sky began to lighten. The shoveled path stayed clear, even after fresh snowfall. I began to pay closer attention, not because I felt afraid, but because the details didn't match normal behavior. One night, temperatures dropped below zero with strong wind gusts. Visibility was poor, and snow was blowing across the highway in sheets. As I neared the property, I saw a figure standing at the end of the cleared driveway. At first, I thought it might be a mailbox or a post covered in snow, but as my headlights hit it, I could see it was a man. He was wearing what looked like a dark winter coat and a knit cap. He stood completely still, facing the highway. I slowed the truck without meaning to. He wasn't waving for help. He wasn't signaling distress. He was just standing there, arms at his sides, looking toward the road. As I drove past, I glanced at my side mirror. He hadn't moved. The wind was strong enough that I could feel my truck shifting slightly, but he remained steady, not leaning, not stepping back. The following night, he was there again. Same position, same stillness. It was around the same time, between 1:10 and 1:20 a.m. I began checking my dashboard clock as I approached the mile marker before the property. Every night for 5 nights straight, he stood at the end of that narrow, shoveled path, facing the highway as my plow came through. I never saw him arrive. I never saw him leave. The porch light remained on behind him, casting a weak glow that barely reached the snow at his feet. I could not see his face clearly because the glare from my headlights washed out the details. He never shielded his eyes. He never turned his head. On the 6th night, I decided to acknowledge him. I reduced speed and gave a short tap on the horn. Not aggressive, just enough to let him know I saw him. There was no reaction, no flinch, no wave, nothing. He didn't even shift his stance. It felt less like someone ignoring me and more like someone who couldn't hear me at all. Later that week, I mentioned it to my supervisor during our morning equipment check. I framed it as a safety concern. Someone standing close to the highway at night during snowstorms could easily be hit. My supervisor contacted the county sheriff's office to request a welfare check on the property. A deputy went out late the next morning. He called us afterward and said the building was empty. No heat, no active utilities. The interior was full of dust and old debris. The driveway was completely snowed over with no sign of a cleared path. He said there were no footprints anywhere near the building. I didn't argue with him. I simply thanked him for checking. That night, when I approached the property, the porch light was gone. No glow in the window. The driveway looked like it always had before, buried and untouched. There was no cleared path, no footprints, no sign that anyone had stood there the previous week. I continued driving that route for the rest of the winter. I never saw the light again. I never saw the man again. The building returned to looking like an abandoned structure slowly collapsing under snow and wind. In the spring, when the snow melted, I drove by during daylight out of curiosity. The driveway gravel showed no signs of being shoveled or disturbed. The front door was secured with rusted chain and lock that looked like it hadn't been moved in years. There were no footprints preserved in hardened snow, no broken boards removed from windows. I tried to come up with practical explanations. Snow can drift in unusual ways. Lights can reflect from distant vehicles or cabins further up the mountain. Fatigue during long night shifts can affect perception. I considered all of that carefully. I had worked night shift for years without incident, and I never had trouble distinguishing shapes from people. The figure I saw was not a shadow. It had weight and form. It stood in the same place for multiple nights. What stays with me most is not the light or the cleared path. It is the stillness of that man in sub-zero wind. I have stood outside in those temperatures to fix equipment. Even layered properly, your body shifts constantly to maintain warmth. You stamp your feet. You tuck your chin. You adjust your gloves. He did none of that. I eventually transferred to a different route closer to town. It had more traffic and fewer isolated properties. I never asked for a formal report about the old building, and no one ever brought up again. Even now, years later, when I drive mountain highways in winter, I find myself scanning the roadside near abandoned structures. I look for porch lights where there shouldn't be any, or for someone standing too still, and whether that should force movement. I never learned who that man was, or whether anyone was ever truly inside that building. All I know is that for 1 week in January, at the same time each night, a light burned in an empty house, and someone stood at the edge of a buried driveway watching the road. Then, without explanation, it all stopped. My name is Everett Coleman. I am 63 years old, and I used to own a small fishing cabin along the Rogue River in southern Oregon. I bought the cabin in 2010, about 15 miles outside Grants Pass. It was a simple one-story structure with a wooden porch facing the river. No cell service, no nearby streetlights, and only one neighboring property about half a mile upstream. After retiring from a long career as a state transportation inspector, I wanted somewhere quiet where I could fish and keep a steady routine. The cabin gave me that. I would drive down every other Thursday, stay through Sunday afternoon, and return home. The schedule rarely changed. Inside, the layout was basic. A small kitchen, a living area with a wood stove, one bedroom, and a bathroom added sometime in the 1980s. I kept a guest logbook on the kitchen table. It was mostly for friends who visited during salmon season. Nothing formal, just a notebook where people could jot down the date and a comment about the trip. The first unusual entry appeared in late September, about 4 years after I purchased a place. I had arrived on a Friday evening, just before sunset. The cabin was exactly as I had left it the previous weekend. Windows locked. Porch chair in its usual place. No tire tracks besides mine in the gravel driveway. The next morning, while making coffee, I noticed a logbook open to the last written page. There was a new line beneath the previous entry from August. It read, "Still quiet here." There was no name attached. Just that sentence and the date from 2 days earlier, which would have been Wednesday. I had not been at the cabin that day. I assumed at first that I had written it myself during my last visit and simply forgotten. The handwriting was neat, slightly slanted. I compared it casually to earlier entries of mine. It looked similar enough that I did not question it deeply. Retirement has a way of blurring days together. 2 weeks later, I returned after being away longer than usual. I had skipped a weekend because of a family commitment. Again, everything looked undisturbed. The door lock showed no scratches. The windows were intact. There was no sign of forced entry. When I walked into the kitchen, the logbook was closed. I opened it out of curiosity. A new line had been added, rivers lower than last time. The handwriting was not mine. This time I was certain. The letters were straighter, more evenly spaced. The ink was darker than the pen I kept in the drawer. I stood there for several minutes, reading the sentence again. The river had indeed dropped slightly over the past week due to reduced rainfall. The observation was accurate. I checked every room carefully. Nothing was missing. My tackle boxes were untouched. The spare blankets were folded neatly. Even the dust on the windowsills looked undisturbed. I walked around the outside perimeter of the cabin. The soil near the porch was dry and compact. There were no visible footprints besides my own from that morning. There were only 3 keys to the cabin. One stayed on my keyring. One was with my brother in Idaho in case of emergency. The third was locked inside a small metal box mounted beneath the porch railing. I kept the key to that lockbox inside a compartment in my truck. I checked the lockbox. The spare key was still inside. Over the next month, I visited on my usual schedule. Each time, there was a new entry waiting in the logbook. Short sentences. Observational. Cold at night now. Fish aren't biting. Lights across the water again. That last sentence caught my attention. There were no houses directly across the river from my cabin. The opposite bank was state forest land with dense brush and no maintained campsites. I had fished that stretch for years and never seen regular activity there. That Saturday night, I decided to stay awake later than usual. I turned off the interior lights around 11:30 p.m. and sat in the living room chair facing the river through the front window. The moonlight reflected faintly off the water. The trees on the opposite bank formed a dark wall. At 12:11 a.m., I saw a light. It was a single, steady white glow about shoulder height above the ground. Not flickering like a campfire. Not moving like a flashlight scanning. Just stationary. I watched it carefully for nearly 20 minutes. It did not shift or dim. It simply remained there, shining across the water. At 12:32 a.m., it turned off instantly. There was no fading. It was there one moment and gone the next. The following morning, I took my aluminum fishing boat across the river. I pulled it up onto the opposite bank and walked through the brush in the area where I had seen the light. The ground was uneven and covered with fallen leaves. There were no clearings, no burn marks, no footprints. I searched for nearly an hour and found nothing that suggested recent human presence. When I returned to my cabin, the logbook was open on the kitchen table. A new line had been written beneath the previous entry. Didn't come over. The ink was still slightly glossy, as if it had not fully dried. I stood very still in the kitchen, listening. The cabin was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I stepped outside immediately and walked the perimeter again. The gravel driveway showed no new tire tracks. The dirt near the porch was undisturbed. I checked the lockbox under the porch. The spare key was gone. There was no damage to the box itself. The lock remained intact. It looked as though someone had simply unlocked it and removed the key. That afternoon, I drove into town and purchased a new deadbolt and lock set. I replaced both front and back door locks. I did not leave a spare key outside this time. I kept both copies with me. For 2 consecutive visits, there were no new entries in the logbook. I began to believe the issue had been resolved. Perhaps someone local would somehow access the old key and then lost interest once the locks were changed and removed the key. That afternoon, I drove into town and purchased a new deadbolt and lock set. I replaced both front and back door locks. I did not leave a spare key outside this time. I kept both copies with me. For 2 consecutive visits, there were no new entries in the logbook. I began to believe the issue had been resolved. Perhaps someone local would somehow access the old key and then lost interest once the locks were changed. In early November, after the first heavy rain of the season, I arrived at the cabin just before dusk. The ground around the porch was soft and muddy. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The logbook was open. A fresh entry had been written in the same steady handwriting. Locks don't matter. I felt a level of frustration more than fear. I searched every cabinet, the crawl space beneath the cabin, and the small shed behind the structure. Nothing appeared disturbed. I drove upstream to speak with my neighbor. He was an older man who stayed year-round. He told me he had not seen anyone near my property. He mentioned occasionally noticing a faint light across the river at night, but assumed it was someone camping illegally. That evening, I left all the interior lights on and remained awake. Around 1:18 a.m., there was a soft knock at the front door. 3 measured taps. Not loud, not urgent. I remained seated and did not respond. The knocking did not repeat. In the morning, I examined the muddy ground around the porch carefully. There were no footprints, no impressions in the soil. The rain from earlier had stopped before midnight, leaving the surface soft enough to capture any weight. Inside, the logbook contained one final entry. Still quiet here. The sentence was identical to the first unexplained message from weeks earlier. I closed a notebook and placed it inside my truck. I did not leave it at the cabin again. I sold the property the following spring. During one of the final showings, the realtor casually mentioned noticing a light across the river during a late viewing. She assumed it was a camper. I did not share my experiences with her. To this day, I still have that logbook stored in a drawer at my primary residence. I have compared the handwriting to mine repeatedly. It does not match. It does not match my brother's either. I do not claim that anything impossible occurred. There may be explanations involving copied keys, unnoticed entries, or someone accessing property in ways I fail to detect. I have considered those possibilities carefully. What remains unresolved for me is a consistency. The timing of the light across the river, the precise awareness reflected in the logbook entries, the absence of footprints in soft ground, and the return of that original sentence at the end. I no longer own property in isolated areas. I still fish occasionally, but only in locations with nearby homes and reliable cell service. There are explanations for most things. I just never found one for that cabin on the Rogue River.